In the year 1873, the small German village of Altenburg sat tucked away in the shadows of the Thuringen forest, a place where life moved slowly and the whispers of folklore lingered in the cobblestone streets. It was a time of great transition in Europe. Science and reason were rising, challenging centuries of superstition, yet the old ways had not been forgotten. Faith, fear, and folk belief still clung stubbornly to the minds of villagers who looked to both priests and physicians when misfortune struck. It was in this world, balanced between enlightenment and darkness, that the story of Emma Richter unfolded, a girl whose life and death defied every explanation of her time. Emma Richter was not born into privilege or prestige. The Richter family was ordinary, living in a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. Her father, a cooper by trade, was known for his quiet discipline, while her mother tended the household with a stern hand softened only by faith. To those who knew them, the Richters were not unlike any other family struggling through the trials of rural life in the 19th century. But from an early age, Emma seemed different. Neighbors recalled her uncanny ability to speak words in languages no one had ever taught her. At first, her parents dismissed it as childish mimicry, perhaps overheard phrases from travelers passing through. Yet as she grew, the phenomena only deepened. By the time she was 12, Emma's behavior had become the subject of fearful gossip. She experienced fainting spells that left her body rigid, eyes wide open, as though staring at something invisible. Sometimes she muttered phrases in Latin, a tongue unfamiliar to her village. Other times she whispered names and dates no one understood. To a community steeped in both Christian teaching and old-world superstition, such signs were terrifying. Some whispered that she was touched by God, others feared she was marked by the devil. The village doctor, a man named Dr. Hansmeyer, examined her repeatedly. His journals, still preserved in fragments, described her symptoms as beyond the scope of common illnesses. He noted her resistance to physical pain. Wounds that should have bled freely closed rapidly. Fevers that should have crippled her left her walking within days. She does not eat for days at a time, Meyer wrote, yet her body does not waste away as one would expect. It is as though the natural laws hesitate when they reach her. To him, she was neither possessed nor blessed, but something stranger, something that medicine in the 19th century could not comprehend. As word of Emma's condition spread, priests came from surrounding towns. In an era when demonic possession was still whispered about in hushed tones, Emma became an object of both fear and fascination. One attempted exorcism was recorded in detail by the parish priest, Father Wilhelm Cross. He claimed that as the rites were spoken, Emma's body convulsed violently, her voice lowering into guttural tones no child could mimic. Yet when the ritual ended, she was calm, almost serene, though she gazed at Father Cross with eyes so piercing he admitted he could not bear to look at her for long. The Richters' modest home soon became a place of uneasy pilgrimage. Physicians from Leipzig and Berlin traveled to witness her condition, their scientific curiosity clashing with the family's desperation. They brought their instruments, their notebooks, their skepticism, but none could categorize Emma's state. Some concluded she suffered from epilepsy or hysteria, diagnoses that were often used as a catch-all for the unexplainable in women at the time. Others believed she was a fraud, though none could explain how a girl from a rural family could so convincingly produce knowledge far beyond her education. In the summer of 1873, Emma's condition grew worse. She fell into long trances, sometimes lasting days, during which she neither ate nor drank. When she awoke, she described visions of distant lands and spoke of inventions not yet known to her world. Her parents, torn between love and fear, kept her hidden as much as they could, but the village had already decided Emma Richter was cursed. By autumn, her body began to fail her. Witnesses claimed that even as her health declined, her mind grew sharper, her words stranger. One physician wrote that her final weeks were the most perplexing study of my career, a challenge not only to medicine but to reason itself. When Emma died at the age of 14, her passing was as mysterious as her life. She closed her eyes, whispered a phrase in a tongue no one understood, and slipped away without a sound. Her death brought no closure. Instead, it left questions that lingered far beyond Altenburg. Was she a victim of a rare illness science had not yet named? A child seized by religious fervor and folklore? Or was she something else entirely, a glimpse into mysteries that reason could never hope to untangle? The story of Emma Richter became a quiet legend, whispered in Germany's darker histories. Her name appeared in scattered medical journals, religious writings, and local folklore, always framed with uncertainty, always defying neat explanation. Even now, over a century later, her life remains one of the 19th century's strangest enigmas. A girl science could not explain. Emma Richter entered the world on a frosty morning in January of 1859. Altenburg, a small German village surrounded by the dark canopy of the Thuringian forest, had seen countless children born into its narrow lanes and smoke-filled cottages. Yet from her earliest days, Emma carried an aura that set her apart. Her birth was uneventful, but neighbors whispered that the hour of her arrival, just before dawn, when the sky was neither dark nor light, was an omen. For most, such murmurs were nothing more than old wives' tales. For the Richters, it was simply the beginning of a life that would be shadowed by questions. Her father, Otto Richter, was a craftsman by trade, fashioning barrels and casks for local brewers. He was a man of few words, proud but grounded, believing that labor was the only anchor in life. Her mother, Marta, was more devout, clinging tightly to her rosary and prayers, her faith serving as armor against the harsh realities of rural living. Emma was their third child, and at first, she seemed no different from her siblings. She was small, frail even, with pale skin and striking gray-blue eyes that often seemed to fix on things unseen. By the age of 3, Emma began to speak earlier than most children. Her words were clear, deliberate, and often far beyond her years. Villagers told stories of her repeating phrases in Latin, though no one in her family knew the language. Marta scolded such talk, insisting it was nothing but childish parroting. But when Emma began to recite whole prayers word for word, prayers that only the village priest spoke during Mass, the whispers grew louder. The Richters tried to dismiss it, focusing instead on the practical challenges of survival. But as Emma grew, so did the oddities. By 6, she would wake in the night screaming, her body rigid, her eyes wide open, as if she were staring at something at the foot of her bed. Marta rushed to comfort her, but Emma never remembered the fits in the morning. Instead, she would describe dreams of strange places, deserts filled with pillars of stone, cities with towers of glass, oceans that burned red beneath the sun. Otto, uncomfortable with such talk, would silence her quickly, warning that such stories would only invite suspicion. In a village like Altenburg, reputation meant survival. Superstition ran deep in its veins. A child marked as different was often seen as cursed, and a cursed family could quickly find itself isolated. Marta knew this well. She tried to guide Emma into silence, teaching her to hide her strange knowledge, but children rarely obey such careful warnings. Emma's curiosity was too strong, her words too strange to ignore. By the time she turned 10, Emma's health began to falter. She would faint suddenly, her body stiffening as though caught by unseen hands. Sometimes these episodes lasted only minutes, sometimes hours. During them, she would mutter in strange tongues, words flowing like streams of sound, unbroken and confident, as though she truly understood what she spoke. One evening, while Otto and Marta tended her during such a spell, she whispered the names of 2 villagers who had died that same week, though no one had spoken of their deaths in the Richter household. Otto grew pale, his usually steady hands trembling. Marta clutched her rosary so tightly it left imprints in her skin. The family turned to the village doctor, Hans Meyer, a stout man with a growing reputation for curiosity. He examined Emma carefully, checking her pulse, her reflexes, her eyes. In his journal, later discovered, he noted, "The child displays symptoms beyond epilepsy or fever. Her trances leave her body rigid, but her awareness, if one may call it that, remains active. She speaks in patterns unfamiliar yet precise. I cannot explain it, though I am certain there is no fraud here." Meyer advised rest, a better diet, and calm. But even he confessed privately to Otto that he had never encountered such a case. Medicine in the 19th century was advancing, yet still primitive in many ways. Theories of hysteria, nervous disorders, and spiritual affliction often overlapped. Emma's condition stood at the crossroads of them all, baffling both physician and priest. The priest, Father Wilhelm Cross, was less cautious in his judgment. When Meyer suggested a natural cause, Cross insisted otherwise. "The girl is afflicted," he told Marta in a hushed tone. "There is no other explanation for such unnatural speech and visions. If not the devil himself, then something of his making." Cross pressed for prayer, fasting, and even minor rites of purification. Marta, caught between her devotion and her love for her child, agreed reluctantly. Otto, ever the practical man, forbade anything that would make their daughter into a spectacle. Yet Altenburg was a small village, and secrecy was fragile. Word spread quickly of Emma's strange spells. Children whispered about her on the way to school, some taunting, others avoiding her altogether. Adults debated whether she was a saint in the making or a danger to the community. The Richters withdrew more and more, allowing Emma fewer visits outside, trying to protect her from both curious eyes and cruel tongues. But the strange phenomena did not stop at words and trances. One winter evening, as snow fell thick across the village, Emma wandered barefoot into the yard. Marta found her standing motionless in the snow, her eyes fixed on the forest beyond. She had been outside for nearly an hour, yet when Marta pulled her back inside, her feet were warm to the touch, unmarked by frostbite. "It is not natural," Marta whispered to Otto that night. He could not disagree. Other incidents followed. Emma once pricked her hand with a sewing needle, and though the wound bled, it closed within minutes, leaving no scar. Another time, she went nearly 3 days without food or water, only to rise from her bed with energy as though she had eaten a full meal. Such events only deepened the divide between those who saw her as cursed and those who whispered of divine blessing. For Emma herself, the experiences were both frightening and isolating. She often confided to her older sister that she felt trapped between two worlds. "It is like something speaks through me," she said once, "and I cannot stop it." Her sister, frightened, told no one. By 1871, as Emma approached adolescence, her episodes became more severe. The doctor noted longer trances, harsher convulsions, and stranger words. Father Cross spoke openly of possession, urging the family to submit to exorcism. Otto resisted, but as the years passed and Emma's condition only grew worse, the pressure from both priest and community became harder to ignore. And so, in 1872, the Richters would reluctantly open their door to outsiders, priests, physicians, and strangers who came seeking answers. For Emma, the quiet years of childhood were gone. Ahead lay a storm of scrutiny, a battle between faith and science, and a fate neither her family nor her village could have imagined. The year 1872 marked a turning point in the life of Emma Richter and her family. For nearly a decade, they had managed to keep her condition hidden from the wider world, shielding her from the prying eyes of neighbors and the scorn of a village that whispered too easily of curses. But secrecy was fragile, and Emma's episodes were becoming too violent, too visible to ignore. One Sunday morning in early spring, as the family sat in church, Emma suddenly convulsed in the pew. Her body arched backward, her small frame rigid as iron, while her mouth spilled words in a rapid torrent of Latin that none but Father Cross could recognize. The congregation froze in horror. Mothers clutched their children close, men stared wide-eyed, and Cross himself dropped his Bible. Otto tried to carry Emma out of the church, but she fought against him with a strength no child should have had. When she finally fell limp in his arms, silence hung heavy over the church. By the time they reached home, the story had already taken root in Altenburg. From that day forward, the Richters could no longer deny the attention of outsiders. Word spread beyond the village, reaching physicians, priests, and even academics who were eager to see this unnatural child. For Otto, it was humiliation. For Marta, it was desperation. And for Emma, it was the beginning of an ordeal that would leave her body and spirit caught between two forces, the rising confidence of science and the enduring grip of faith. Dr. Hans Meyer, who had treated Emma since her earliest episodes, was the first to call for broader medical attention. Though skeptical of supernatural claims, even he admitted that her condition defied the limited explanations at his disposal. In May of 1872, he invited two colleagues from Leipzig, Dr. Wilhelm Bauer, a neurologist, and Dr. Ernst Vogel, a physician with a keen interest in the growing field of psychiatry. Together, they examined Emma in the Richters' modest cottage, taking careful notes as she drifted in and out of her strange states. Their methods were clinical, even cold. They pricked her skin with pins to test her reaction, only to find that she barely flinched. They measured her pulse during trances and found it unusually slow, her breathing shallow yet steady, as though her body were in some suspended state. When asked simple questions during these episodes, Emma responded in voices that seemed not her own. Sometimes a whisper, sometimes a low growl, sometimes in words none of them understood. Bauer insisted she suffered from epilepsy, pointing to her convulsions as proof. Vogel, however, argued for hysteria, a diagnosis frequently, and wrongly, applied to women and young girls during the 19th century. Meyer, more cautious, admitted neither explanation satisfied him. "If this is epilepsy," he wrote later, "it is of a kind unknown to medicine. And if hysteria, it is unlike any I have witnessed. She is other." The doctor's visits did little to help Emma. If anything, their probing left her weaker, exhausted by their endless experiments. Otto grew angry at their intrusion, while Marta clung more tightly to her faith. To her, Emma was not a patient but a child caught in a battle that no doctor could resolve. She turned instead to Father Cross, who had long urged the family to allow a spiritual remedy. Cross was convinced that Emma was possessed. Her strange languages, her unnatural resistance to harm, and the uncanny knowledge she displayed, such as naming events before they happened, all pointed in his mind to demonic influence. With Marta's reluctant agreement, he prepared to perform an exorcism. The night of the ritual, a storm raged outside, lightning flashing across the sky as though nature itself bore witness. The small church, lit by flickering candles, echoed with Cross's solemn Latin prayers. Emma, frail yet unyielding, sat bound in a wooden chair at the center of the room. At first, she was quiet, her head bowed as though asleep. But when Cross began the rites, she stirred. Witnesses later claimed her voice deepened into a guttural growl unrecognizable as hers. Her body strained against the chair, eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. At one point, she shouted words in a dialect of Greek that Cross recognized only in fragments. The priest pressed on, sprinkling holy water, commanding the spirit to leave her body. The storm outside howled, thunder shaking the church's rafters, until at last Emma slumped forward, silent and still. For a moment, it seemed the ritual had worked. Cross declared her freed, Marta wept with relief, and Otto stood stiff with guarded hope. But the victory was short-lived. Within a week, Emma's fits returned with renewed ferocity. Her trances lasted longer, her mutterings grew stranger, and once, she collapsed so violently that even Otto feared she might never rise again. The failed exorcism divided Altenburg. Some believed Cross had not done enough, urging more intense rituals. Others argued the child should be taken to a hospital in Berlin, where modern science might provide an answer. A few even whispered that Emma should be hidden away entirely, for fear her curse would spread misfortune. For Emma, the attention was unbearable. She withdrew into herself, spending long hours staring out the cottage window toward the forest. Sometimes she sketched strange symbols in the dirt with her finger, symbols that no one recognized. Other times she spoke quietly to herself, as if holding a conversation with someone unseen. Marta prayed constantly, her health deteriorating from the stress, while Otto grew harder, his patience thinning with each passing day. By the end of 1872, Emma's case had reached beyond Altenburg. Articles appeared in local papers, describing her as the enigma of Altenburg. Some journalists framed her as a curiosity of science, others as a child cursed by God. Letters arrived at the Richter home from both scholars and zealots, each offering their own theory, each demanding a chance to see the girl. The Richters were torn. To open their home meant subjecting Emma to further scrutiny, perhaps exploitation. Yet to close their doors meant no chance of answers, no hope of relief. Otto leaned toward secrecy, Marta toward faith. Emma herself had no choice in the matter. Her life had become a spectacle, her suffering a battleground between two worlds. And as the new year dawned, Emma's condition only worsened. The trances grew longer, the visions stranger, and the whispers louder. By the time 1873 arrived, the year that would mark her death, the lines between science and faith, medicine and superstition, had blurred beyond recognition. Both claimed authority over her soul, yet neither could explain the mystery that was consuming her life. By early 1873, Emma Richter was no longer just a troubled girl hidden in a quiet village. She had become a subject of fascination, pity, and fear far beyond the borders of Altenburg. What began as hushed whispers in a small church had grown into something larger, a mystery that crossed into the worlds of science, religion, and public spectacle. It started with a single newspaper article in Leipzig. A curious journalist, having heard of the failed exorcism, traveled to Altenburg in late December of 1872. Otto Richter resisted at first, unwilling to expose his daughter to strangers yet again. But the man came with promises of discretion, assuring the family that he wished only to record her case as a medical marvel. Otto reluctantly allowed it, thinking perhaps such exposure would pressure doctors into offering real help. When the article appeared, it described Emma as a child caught between heaven and hell, her body subject to mysteries no physician can name. The writer embellished freely, claiming she spoke fluently in dead languages, that her body levitated during trances, that animals grew restless in her presence. Altenburg residents recognized the exaggerations, but readers elsewhere did not. Within weeks, Emma's name was whispered in coffee houses in Dresden, in university halls in Berlin, even in taverns across Vienna. She was no longer Emma Richter, the sickly daughter of Otto and Marta. She was the girl science could not explain. Letters began pouring into the Richter home. Some were from scholars eager to study her case. Others came from priests urging the family to surrender her to the church. And many were from ordinary people, each offering their own interpretation that she was a prophet, a witch, a vessel of demons, or a miracle child touched by God. Otto burned most of the letters, but Marta, fragile and devout, read them as if they were messages of divine importance. She often wept over the words of strangers who claimed they prayed for Emma's soul. Her faith deepened with every line, while Otto grew more bitter at what he called the vultures of curiosity. By spring of 1873, the curious began to arrive in Altenburg. Some came quietly, scholars in long coats, carrying notebooks and magnifying glasses. Others came openly, like pilgrims, standing outside the Richter home as if it were a shrine. Children dared each other to peek through the windows. Neighbors grumbled about the attention, both resenting and feeding off the gossip it brought. Emma herself became increasingly withdrawn. She rarely spoke to her family in her own voice anymore. At times she would sit silently, staring at the strangers who gathered outside the cottage. On other days she reacted violently, thrashing in bed or screaming in languages her parents did not understand. It was as though she sensed she had become an object of spectacle, her suffering no longer private but performed for the world. One of the first scholars to arrive was Professor Ludwig Keller of Heidelberg University. A man fascinated by the boundaries of human consciousness, Keller spent 3 days observing Emma. He asked her questions in multiple languages, German, French, Latin, and Greek, and recorded her responses. In some trances she answered with surprising accuracy. At other times, her replies dissolved into nonsense. Keller left Altenburg both baffled and thrilled. In his published report, he described Emma as the most compelling evidence yet that the human mind possesses layers unexplored by modern science. Not all visitors were so respectful. A traveling showman from Dresden attempted to persuade Otto to let Emma be exhibited in his cabinet of curiosities, alongside wax figures and medical oddities. Otto nearly struck the man for the insult. Yet the very fact such an offer was made revealed how far Emma's reputation had spread. She was no longer seen as a daughter but as a commodity, a thing to be observed, debated, and, if one was cruel enough, exploited. The church grew more insistent as well. Father Cross pressed Otto to permit a second, more forceful exorcism, arguing that the first had failed because it was not carried out with sufficient ritual authority. He claimed to have secured approval from higher clergy, men willing to travel to Altenburg to aid in the battle for Emma's soul. Marta leaned toward agreement, clinging to the hope that faith might yet free her child. Otto, however, resisted fiercely. To him the first ritual had nearly broken Emma. Another might destroy her completely. In the meantime, Emma's trances deepened. Witnesses claimed she sometimes spoke of things she could not possibly know, accidents that later occurred in nearby villages, the names of strangers who had written letters but never revealed themselves. Once, she looked directly at a visiting scholar and whispered details of his past sins, leaving him pale and shaken. Such episodes fueled both sides of the debate. To the faithful, it was proof of demonic possession. To the scientists, it suggested hidden capabilities of the human mind. As the debate raged, Emma's health declined. She ate little, her body growing frail, her eyes sunken. Yet in her trances, she displayed bursts of terrifying strength, thrashing against restraints or speaking in voices that filled the small room with unnatural authority. Marta prayed constantly, kneeling at Emma's bedside, whispering hymns into the storm of her daughter's affliction. Otto, wary and hollow-eyed, began to drink heavily as though numbing himself against the reality he could not change. By midsummer, Emma's case had reached international attention. Reports of the Altenburg enigma appeared in British newspapers, translated into French journals, even debated in salons in Paris. Each retelling twisted the story further, turning Emma into a figure of legend even as she wasted away in her bed. For the Richter family, the attention brought no relief. Their home was crowded with strangers, their privacy shattered, their daughter reduced to a phenomenon. Altenburg itself seemed divided between pride at its notoriety and shame at the suffering it hosted. And Emma, caught in the center, was less a girl than a symbol of mystery, of fear, of the fragile boundary between knowledge and the unknown. By the autumn of 1873, one truth became clear. Emma Richter was not simply a child afflicted with an unexplained illness. She had become a battlefield upon which the 19th century fought its greatest war, between faith and reason, superstition and science, the seen and the unseen. And though none could yet know it, her final months would bring that battle to its tragic conclusion. By late autumn of 1873, the Richter household had transformed from a modest home into something closer to a prison. Curtains were drawn day and night, shielding Emma from the dozens of strangers who lingered outside, hungry for a glimpse of the girl whispered about across Europe. Yet the darkness inside those walls was far heavier than the gossip beyond them. Emma was no longer the pale but gentle child she had once been. Her body had withered, her bones sharp beneath her skin, her eyes sunken and hollow. At times she lay so still that Marta would press her ear to her daughter's chest, desperate to hear the faint rhythm of breath. Yet within hours, Emma could erupt into terrifying strength, thrashing against her sheets, speaking in voices so deep and guttural they seemed impossible for a 16-year-old girl. The episodes grew more violent with each passing week. Otto, once a stern but patient father, now wore the look of a man haunted. He rarely spoke except to bark orders or curse the situation. At night he drank heavily by the fireplace, staring into the flames as if searching for answers. Marta, by contrast, grew thinner and paler from her endless prayers. She rarely left Emma's bedside, clutching a rosary so tightly her knuckles bled. What disturbed them most were Emma's visions. She would fall into trances and describe scenes with eerie detail. Fires sweeping through neighboring towns, storms rising on the horizon, the deaths of villagers who later succumbed to illness. Her accuracy unsettled even the most skeptical. One night she called out the name of a local farmer, insisting he had died. When Otto ran into town the next morning, he discovered the man had been crushed beneath a wagon just hours earlier. Word of such incidents spread quickly, amplifying her reputation. Some claimed she was a prophet, cursed with sight beyond the natural. Others whispered that she was a demon in human flesh, her visions nothing more than the devil's trickery. For Emma, there was no comfort in either interpretation. Each revelation left her weaker, as though every glimpse into the unseen world drained what little life she still possessed. As winter crept in, a suffocating cold settled over Altenburg. The Richter cottage became a place of dread. Scholars who once arrived eagerly now left shaken, unwilling to face the intensity of Emma's condition. Even the bravest priests hesitated to return after hearing the guttural voices and witnessing the convulsions that twisted her frail frame. Yet one night in November, Father Cross returned with 2 assistants, determined to try again what he believed must be done, another exorcism. Otto opposed him furiously, insisting the first attempt had nearly killed his daughter. But Marta, clinging to faith as her last hope, begged her husband to relent. With eyes full of exhaustion, Otto gave a broken nod. The ritual began in the dead of night. Emma was bound gently to her bed with strips of cloth, not out of cruelty but to protect her from thrashing into the wooden frame. Candles cast long shadows against the cottage walls as Cross intoned the ancient Latin rites. At first Emma lay still, her lips murmuring softly in what sounded like prayers. But soon her voice shifted, deepening into that terrible growl. Her body arched unnaturally, and her eyes opened wide, gleaming with a light that seemed not of this world. The assistants clutched their crucifixes, trembling. Cross pressed on, commanding the spirit to depart. Emma shrieked, her cries mingling with the howling wind outside. At one point, the flames of every candle guttered as if snuffed by an unseen hand. Marta screamed, falling to her knees, while Otto stood frozen, torn between fury and despair. The ritual lasted for hours, the cottage echoing with chants, screams, and silence so heavy it seemed to crush the very air. At dawn, Emma collapsed into unconsciousness, her frail chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Cross declared the demon weakened but not defeated. Otto, shaking with rage, threw the priest and his assistants out, swearing never again to subject his daughter to such torment. In the days that followed, Emma barely spoke. When she did, Her words were fragmented, broken German whispers of Latin, and strange phrases no one could translate. She no longer recognized her mother's face or responded to her father's touch. It was as if the Emma they once knew was fading, leaving only the shell of a girl consumed by forces no one could name. The Richters themselves began to unravel. Otto, consumed by guilt and helplessness, grew distant and volatile. Marta seemed to age years in weeks, her hair streaked with gray, her eyes hollow with sleeplessness. Their once quiet home was now a place of endless tension, grief, and waiting, for what neither could say. By December, Emma's condition worsened. She refused food, her frail body wasting away until every rib was visible beneath her skin. At night, her cries echoed through the cottage, chilling and otherworldly, waking neighbors who swore the sounds were not human. Some claimed they saw lights flickering in the woods beyond the Richter home. Others insisted they heard whispers carried on the wind. The line between reality and superstition blurred with every passing day. And then, in the final weeks of 1873, Emma began to speak of her own death. In her trances, she whispered that she would not live to see another spring. She described visions of herself lying still in her bed, candles surrounding her body, her parents weeping at her side. Marta wept at the words, refusing to believe them, while Otto stormed from the room, unable to face the possibility that his daughter's prophecy might be true. Yet the inevitability hung over the house like a shadow. Emma's strength was nearly gone. Each breath was a struggle, each word a labor. Whether she was victim of illness, possession, or something in between, the battle for her life was reaching its final hour. And as the year drew to its bitter close, the people of Altenburg waited with grim fascination. Would the girl who confounded science and defied faith survive the winter, or would her death seal forever the mystery no one could explain? By December of 1873, the Richter home was less a house than a chamber of waiting. Silence weighed heavy in every corner, broken only by Emma's faint breathing or sudden cries that echoed in the night. Altenburg's villagers no longer whispered about her. They spoke openly of her as one already marked for death, and in truth, even her parents sensed it. Emma was slipping beyond their reach. Her body had wasted away to little more than skin and bone. She no longer had the strength to rise from her bed. Her once bright hair clung thinly to her scalp, her lips dry and cracked. Yet her eyes, though sunken, still held that strange, unearthly gleam, as if she saw things no one else could. At times she stared into empty corners of the room, smiling faintly as if in conversation. At other times she shrieked in terror, clawing at her sheets, begging unseen figures to leave her in peace. On the evening of December 15, Marta knelt by Emma's bed, whispering prayers through tears. Otto stood nearby, his hands trembling as he poured himself another measure of snaps. He no longer argued with Marta, no longer cursed the priests or the doctors. He had surrendered to despair, a broken man watching helplessly as his only child withered before him. That night, Emma spoke clearly for the first time in weeks. Her voice, faint but steady, cut through the silence. "I will not see the spring." Marta froze, clutching her daughter's hand. Otto turned away, refusing to listen. But Emma continued, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the room. "The light is coming for me. Do not be afraid when it takes me." The words left Marta shaken to her core. She begged Emma not to speak so, but the girl only closed her eyes and drifted into another trance. In the days that followed, Emma grew weaker still. She refused food entirely, her stomach rejecting even water. Her body was failing, but her mind seemed oddly alert in her visions. She spoke of a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed, of voices calling her name in languages she did not know. Once, in the dead of night, Marta woke to find Emma sitting upright, her eyes wide, whispering, "They are waiting for me." When asked who, Emma only shook her head and lay back down. On December 22, a final attempt was made to intervene. Father Cross, still convinced her affliction was spiritual, arrived with holy oils and his crucifix. Otto refused to let him inside at first, but Marta's pleading won him over. The priest entered, wary but determined, and began prayers beside Emma's bed. She stirred faintly, her lips moving in whispers too soft to hear. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and fixed them on Cross. "You cannot help me," she rasped. The priest faltered, his voice shaking as he continued the prayers. But Emma's words grew louder. "It is not for you to stop. It is already done." Her body convulsed once, then went limp, breathing shallow but steady. Cross withdrew, shaken, muttering that only God could decide her fate now. 2 nights later, the end came. A bitter wind howled outside as snow blanketed the village. Inside, the Richter cottage was lit only by a few flickering candles. Marta sat by her daughter's side, clutching her hand, whispering hymns. Otto sat in the corner, head in his hands, unable to face what he knew was inevitable. Emma stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment, they seemed clearer than they had in months. She looked at her mother, then at her father, and a faint smile touched her lips. "It's time," she whispered. Her breathing grew shallow, each inhale a labor. Marta wept openly, begging her to hold on, but Emma only shook her head. Her gaze drifted upward as though following something unseen. Then, in a voice barely audible, she whispered words that neither Otto nor Marta could fully understand. Some thought it was Latin, others some unknown tongue. The final word was clear enough: light. With that, her body relaxed. Her chest rose once more, then stilled. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marta clung to her daughter's lifeless form, sobbing uncontrollably, while Otto stood frozen, his face pale and hollow, as if all strength had left him. Emma Richter was dead. 16 years old, her life ended not by the hands of man, nor by any illness that could be named, but by a mystery no one had ever unraveled. News of her death spread quickly. Within days, newspapers across Germany reported the passing of the Altenburg enigma. Some framed it as the tragic end of a sickly girl. Others declared it proof of spiritual warfare, her death the final victory of forces unseen. Scholars debated fiercely, their journals filled with speculation. Was it epilepsy, hysteria, starvation, or something darker beyond the grasp of reason? Her funeral drew crowds from near and far. Villagers who once feared her now wept openly. Strangers who had traveled only to witness her suffering came to pay respects. The small church overflowed, its bells tolling solemnly as her coffin, simple and unadorned, was carried to the graveyard. Marta collapsed more than once during the service, while Otto stood rigid, his grief locked deep inside. In the weeks that followed, her story spread even further. Some said strange lights appeared over her grave at night. Others claimed to hear whispers when passing by. For Altenburg, Emma Richter's death did not end the mystery, it deepened it. For her parents, however, there was no mystery, only loss. Marta spent her days in mourning, clinging to the belief that her daughter was now at peace in God's hands. Otto grew more silent, more withdrawn, haunted by the sense that he had failed her. Their cottage, once alive with the sounds of a family, became a hollow shell, echoing only with memory. And so Emma Richter passed from life into legend. A girl science could not explain, faith could not save, and history would never forget. The death of Emma Richter in December 1873 did not silence the world's curiosity. If anything, it ignited it. The day after her burial, Altenburg seemed to breathe easier, as though the oppressive weight that had hung over the village for years had finally lifted. The restless crowds began to thin. The villagers returned to their routines, and the Richter's cottage sank into quiet mourning. Yet outside Altenburg, Emma's name grew louder than ever. Within a week, the Leipzig Gazette printed a long obituary. The piece painted Emma as a tragic child who bore mysteries beyond human understanding, and it did not hesitate to repeat the more sensational details: her trances, her prophetic visions, the failed exorcisms. Soon other papers picked up the story. In Dresden, she was described as a martyr of unseen forces. In Berlin, she was the medical riddle of the century. In Paris, she became the phantom girl of Altenburg. Each retelling twisted her further into legend. Doctors and scientists were quick to respond. Some dismissed the entire affair as rural superstition exaggerated by rumor. In the medical journal Deutsche Klinik, Dr. Wilhelm Bauer wrote a scathing piece, insisting Emma's condition had been nothing more than unchecked epilepsy complicated by malnutrition. He criticized the Richters for clinging to primitive beliefs and condemned the priests for aggravating her illness with medieval rituals. But others were less certain. Dr. Ernst Vogel, who had personally examined Emma, published a more cautious account. He admitted that while her symptoms could resemble hysteria, many did not fit neatly into known patterns. Her apparent ability to speak languages she had never learned troubled him most. "If this is illness," he wrote, "it is of a kind yet to be named. If it is deception, it is one no child could sustain for years." Theological voices were equally divided. Father Cross insisted that Emma had been possessed, that her death marked not defeat but release. In his sermons, He described her as a victim of dark forces who had claimed her before the church could free her. Other priests disagreed, warning against using Emma's suffering as proof of demons. They urged caution, suggesting her case should inspire prayer, not spectacle. Meanwhile, ordinary people kept the story alive through rumor and invention. Some claimed to have seen strange lights hovering over her grave in the churchyard. Others swore they heard a girl's voice whispering their name when they passed the Richter cottage at night. These tales spread quickly, feeding the sense that Emma's mystery had not ended with her death. By early 1874, Emma's case had become a subject of academic debate across Europe. In lecture halls from Vienna to Paris, professors cited her as an example when discussing the limits of human knowledge. Some saw her as proof of untapped psychic abilities, the first hint of what would later be called parapsychology. Others used her as a warning of what happened when superstition overshadowed science. The more people debated, the less Emma seemed like a person at all. She became a symbol of science's failure, of religion's persistence, of mystery itself. Her frail body, her haunted eyes, her whispered prophecies, all were transformed into images that suited whatever story people wanted to tell. For Marta and Otto, this was salt in the wound. To them, she was simply their daughter taken too soon. To the world, she was a legend. The Richters themselves withdrew completely after her death. Marta seldom left the house, spending her days in prayer. Otto grew harsher, bitter at the endless letters that still arrived from strangers who wished to claim Emma's story. Some begged for relics, locks of her hair, scraps of clothing, as if she were a saint. Others demanded the family reveal the truth. Otto burned the letters without reading them. For him, Emma's life had been torment enough. Despite Otto's efforts, the legend only grew. By the summer of 1874, a pamphlet circulated across Germany with lurid titles like The Possessed Child of Altenburg and The Demon's Daughter. Traveling storytellers wove Emma's case into their tales, adding embellishments until she seemed less human and more myth. In one version, she was said to have floated above her bed. In another, she had predicted the Franco-Prussian War years before it began. None of it was true, but truth mattered little when legend sold so well. Yet not all remembered her as a curiosity. Some mourned sincerely. Letters of condolence arrived from families who had lost children to unexplained illnesses, parents who saw in Emma a reflection of their own grief. To them, she was not a demon or a prophet, but a girl who suffered terribly while the world looked on. Emma's grave became a quiet place of pilgrimage. Visitors left flowers, small crosses, even handwritten notes. The villagers grew used to the sight of strangers kneeling by the modest headstone, whispering prayers or staring in silence. Some swore the earth there always felt warmer than the rest of the graveyard. Others insisted it was colder. In time, Emma's story slipped into history, carried forward in fragments, a medical report here, a priest's sermon there, a local tale told to frighten children. But in the immediate years after her death, she occupied a unique place in Europe's imagination. She was neither fully explained nor fully forgotten. She lingered, much as she had in life, on the boundary between worlds. For Altenburg, the memory remained sharp. The Richters never recovered. Marta died in 1877, her health broken by grief. Otto followed not long after, found lifeless at the cottage table, a bottle at his side. With their passing, the Richter line ended, leaving behind only the story of their daughter, a story that no one could ever fully explain. And so, Emma Richter's death did not close her mystery. Instead, it marked the beginning of something larger, a legacy that blurred the lines between fact and fable, science and faith, tragedy and legend. Even in death, Emma refused to be understood. Long after Emma Richter's fragile body was lowered into the cold earth, her name refused to die. In Altenburg, silence returned to the narrow lanes, yet whispers drifted like smoke in the evening air. For many villagers, her memory carried the weight of unfinished business, as though she had never truly left. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Emma's story began to slide from tragedy into legend. It started with children. Barely a month after her burial, mothers scolded their little ones not to wander into the woods after dusk, warning that Emma's ghost still walks there. In some versions, she was searching for peace. In others, she hunted for playmates to join her in the grave. Before long, every strange sound in the night, every rustle of branches, every flicker of candlelight, was attributed to her restless spirit. Teenagers dared each other to sneak into the graveyard and touch her headstone. They told stories of cold hands brushing their shoulders, of soft whispers in the wind that carried their names. One boy swore he had seen Emma standing at the church gate, her white burial dress gleaming faintly against the night, her eyes wide and hollow. Whether he had imagined it or not, the story spread quickly, and the legend grew teeth. By the spring of 1874, traveling storytellers had already seized upon Emma's tale, wandering from town to town. They spun her suffering into eerie narratives designed to captivate audiences hungry for a thrill. In some stories, she was a saint who had battled unseen demons. In others, she was a witch, child whose family had paid the price for consorting with the devil. These tales were embroidered with new details. Emma walking backward on ceilings, Emma reciting the sins of strangers, Emma predicting deaths with uncanny accuracy. Altenburg villagers, hearing these stories from travelers, scarcely recognized the girl they had known. Her grave became the focal point of the legend. Pilgrims arrived not merely to grieve but to seek answers or blessings or protection. Some left offerings, dried flowers, candles, even children's toys. Others came with darker motives, scratching symbols into the soil, whispering incantations, treating the site as though it were a portal to the otherworld. Rumors spread of glowing lights at midnight, of shadows that lingered near her stone, of a faint voice humming lullabies no one could quite place. The church tried to contain these tales, but even Father Cross could not silence them. His sermons condemning false superstition seemed only to fuel the rumors further. Villagers would leave mass whispering, "If the priest fears her, perhaps she truly has power." Outside Altenburg, the legend grew grander. In Leipzig, pamphlets described Emma as a girl who had predicted revolutions and disasters. In Paris, she was woven into Gothic literature, painted as a tragic heroine who had straddled the boundary between life and death. In Vienna, spiritualists claimed her as evidence of the thin veil separating the living from the dead. Each retelling moved her further from the truth, reshaping her into whatever figure the teller desired. By the 1880s, Emma Richter had become a staple of German folklore. Collections of ghost stories featured The Girl Who Could Not Die, The Prophetess of Altenburg, or The White Child. She appeared in ballads sung by traveling musicians. Her tales stretched to include impossible feats summoning storms, speaking with angels, foretelling the fall of empires. Yet the strangest part of the legend was not how it spread, but how often people insisted on personal encounters. Farmers claimed Emma appeared to them in dreams, warning them of poor harvests or guiding them to hidden wells. Mothers swore her spirit watched over sick children, whispering them through fevers. But there were darker accounts. 2 men stumbling home from taverns claimed to see her pale form blocking their path, her eyes blazing with accusation. One tale told of a merchant who, passing through Altenburg at night, saw a girl walking beside the road. Believing her lost, he offered her a ride. She climbed into his cart without a word. When he turned to ask her name, she was gone, vanished into the dark. When he told the villagers, they only nodded and said, "You have seen Emma." Over time, Emma's story no longer belonged to the Richters. It belonged to the people. To the storytellers, the dreamers, the fearful, and the curious. She was no longer just a girl who had suffered. She was a legend, a symbol of mystery. Parents used her name to frighten children into obedience. Travelers carried her tale across Europe. Spiritualists held seances to speak with her. Scientists continued to debate her symptoms, but their words were drowned out by ghost stories. Still, beneath all the embellishments, one thing never changed: the image of a frail girl, her eyes haunted, her life cut short by forces no one could explain. Whether people saw her as demon-possessed, divinely gifted, or eternally restless, she remained unforgettable. In Altenburg, her grave weathered with time, yet it never lost visitors. Decades after her death, candles still burned there at night, lit by strangers who whispered prayers or requests. Some came hoping for healing, others for protection, and a few simply to feel the thrill of standing near what they believed was sacred, or cursed, ground. The Richter's cottage fell into ruin after Otto and Marta's deaths. Yet even its crumbling walls became part of the legend. Passers-by claimed to hear a girl's laughter from within, or to glimpse pale faces staring out from broken windows. Children dared each other to step inside, and those who did swore they heard footsteps behind them, though no one was there. Thus, Emma Richter's story entered the long chain of European folklore. Like the Black Forest witches, the haunted castles along the Rhine, and the spectral soldiers said to wander old battlefields. She became part of the landscape of fear and wonder. To some, she was a warning about meddling with forces unseen. To others, she was proof that mystery could never be banished by reason alone. And perhaps that was her final legacy, to remind people that not everything could be explained, and that sometimes the line between tragedy and legend is as thin as the veil between the living and the dead. Even as the century turned and Altenburg changed, the villagers still spoke her name, quietly, respectfully, with a trace of fear. Emma Richter, the girl science could not explain, had become something more. She had become immortal. By the dawn of the 20th century, the story of Emma Richter had already passed into the realm of folklore. In Altenburg, her grave was still visited, though many of the villagers who remembered her firsthand had died. Children now heard of her through ghost stories whispered by grandparents, and traveling storytellers had long since made her a staple of eerie ballads and cautionary tales. Yet Emma's mystery had not been buried with the 19th century. In fact, the new century seemed determined to bring her case back into the light. In 1901, a German psychiatrist named Dr. Friedrich Lang stumbled across a faded pamphlet titled The Possessed Child of Altenburg in a Dresden bookshop. Fascinated, he began digging into Emma's case. What started as idle curiosity grew into a full-blown investigation. Lang traveled to Altenburg, interviewing elderly villagers who still recalled the strange events of the 1870s. He collected stories, examined parish records, and eventually unearthed the sparse notes left by Dr. Ernst Vogel, the physician who had once studied Emma. Lang was convinced that Emma represented a turning point in medical history, a case that bridged superstition and science. He published his findings in 1903, in an article that framed Emma not as a demon-touched child but as an early example of what modern psychiatry might call dissociative phenomena. His work sparked renewed interest. Across Europe, researchers in medicine psychology and the burgeoning field of parapsychology began debating Emma anew. For the spiritualist movement, which had swept across Europe and America at the turn of the century, Emma was a perfect emblem. Spiritualists saw in her story proof of psychic sensitivity, the kind of mediumistic power that allowed certain souls to glimpse beyond the veil. Seances were held where mediums claimed to contact Emma herself. One particularly famous séance in Vienna, held in 1905, ended with the medium entering a violent trance, speaking in a child's voice, and repeating a German prayer almost identical to one Emma had supposedly whispered during her final days. Whether genuine or theatrical, the performance convinced many believers that Emma's spirit lingered, but scientists remained divided. Some sought rational explanations. In 1908, Helena Braun of Berlin proposed that Emma may have suffered from a severe neurological condition, perhaps a form of temporal lobe epilepsy combined with catatonia. Others, like the French psychologist Pierre Duret, argued that the unexplained aspects of her case, her alleged fluency in languages she had never studied, her prophetic utterances, pointed not to illness but to some form of latent human ability. Emma Richter, Duret wrote, may be the earliest documented case of a psychic child in modern Europe. By this time, Emma's life had been reconstructed into something resembling a case file. Historians, folklorists, and paranormal researchers compiled records from newspapers, parish registers, medical notes, and oral testimonies. The file was passed around academic circles and eventually stored in the archives of the Leipzig Historical Society. Within its pages, Emma was preserved not just as a ghost story, but as an enduring riddle. Altenburg itself became something of a pilgrimage site for researchers. In 1910, the Society for Psychical Research in London sent an investigator named Arthur Reynolds to examine Emma's grave and interview the remaining villagers. His report, though skeptical, admitted that the persistence of Emma's legend was remarkable. It is rare, he wrote, for a single child's suffering to echo across so many decades, yet here we find a story that refuses to be silenced. As the years passed, the story took on new layers. The rise of cinema brought Gothic tales to the screen, and though Emma's name was rarely used directly, films of the silent era borrowed heavily from her legend, the pale child, the prophetic visions, the haunting presence beyond the grave. In literature, too, Emma's ghost lingered. Writers in Germany and France referenced her case in novels and essays, transforming her from a real girl into an archetype of the mysterious and the uncanny. But perhaps the strangest turn came during the 1930s, when parapsychologists revisited Emma as part of their efforts to legitimize psychic research. They argued that her symptoms mirrored those of psychic children, reported in other countries, from Scotland to Russia. Journals of the time discussed Emma alongside cases of poltergeists and haunted children, suggesting she might have been the center of a kind of psychic disturbance. To skeptics, this was nothing more than a modern gloss on old superstition. To believers, it was proof that Emma had been far more than a sick child. She had been a gateway. The outbreak of the Second World War shifted focus away from such mysteries, yet Emma's name never fully disappeared. In the 1950s, a new generation of folklorists rediscovered her story. They recorded how the tale had morphed over time. In some versions, Emma was an angelic figure, in others, a cursed witch child, and in yet others, a restless ghost. Each telling revealed more about the fears and hopes of the people who repeated it than about Emma herself. By the close of the 20th century, Emma Richter was no longer just a local curiosity. She was a case study cited in books on folklore, psychology, and the paranormal. Scholars debated her symptoms, novelists borrowed her image, paranormal enthusiasts still visited her grave, hoping for a glimpse of the inexplicable. What made Emma endure when so many others were forgotten? Perhaps it was the contradictions in her story, part medical mystery, part ghost tale, part tragedy. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that no one ever solved her riddle. Science, religion, and folklore had all tried, and none had succeeded. And so, more than a century after her death, Emma Richter remained suspended between worlds, between history and legend, between fact and imagination, between the living and the dead. The case file in Leipzig still bears her name. Its pages, yellowed and brittle, contain testimonies, medical notes, clippings, and letters. Each document adds detail, yet none answers the central question: who truly was Emma Richter? The file ends as it began, with mystery. And perhaps that is why Emma's story still matters. For in her life, and in the legends that grew from it, she became a symbol of everything humanity cannot explain, but cannot forget. By the mid-20th century, Emma Richter's name had mostly faded from everyday conversation. Altenburg villagers still spoke of her in hushed tones, and researchers occasionally cited her case in dusty journals. But for the most part, she was little more than a forgotten ghost of the 19th century. That changed in the 1960s, when the world rediscovered its appetite for the strange, the paranormal, and the unexplained. The wave began with the rise of television documentaries that sought to explore mysteries from history. In 1964, a German broadcaster aired The Girl Science Couldn't Explain, a 1-hour black and white program that revisited Emma's story. The producers dug into archives, interviewed folklorists, and dramatized her life using shadowy reenactments. Though the documentary was criticized for blending fact with sensationalism, it struck a chord with audiences. Overnight, Emma became a talking point again, her name whispered in households across Germany and beyond. Soon, her story jumped borders. British tabloids picked it up, running lurid headlines like, "Possessed Child of Altenburg Still Haunts Germany." American paranormal magazines, which were thriving in the 1970s alongside UFO lore and psychic research, featured Emma as part of Europe's greatest mysteries. For the first time in nearly a century, Emma Richter's story was global. The rise of the paranormal research boom in the 1970s sealed her place in modern legend. Ghost hunting groups from England and the United States traveled to Altenburg, eager to investigate her grave and the ruins of the Richter cottage. Many reported strange phenomena: cold spots, whispers on tape recorders, sudden flickers of light in photographs. Skeptics dismissed these as tricks of imagination or faulty equipment. But for believers, it was proof that Emma's spirit lingered still. In 1978, the Society for Paranormal Inquiry included Emma in its book Children Beyond Death, alongside other cases of supposed psychic or haunted children. The book sold widely, feeding public fascination. For young readers in particular, Emma became both frightening and tragic, a child who had suffered terribly, misunderstood by her era, now remembered only as a restless ghost. Altenburg itself was transformed. By the 1980s, curious visitors arrived each summer, seeking the grave of the ghost girl. Locals, weary of endless questions, sometimes embellished tales for tourists. Stories emerged of Emma appearing at midnight on the anniversary of her death, or of travelers feeling her icy hand clutch their own near the churchyard. The village benefited quietly from the influx of tourism, even as it struggled to separate fact from fiction. The modern era also brought new interpretations of Emma's case. Psychiatrists re-examined the old reports, suggesting she may have suffered from schizophrenia, encephalitis, or even a rare autoimmune disease that could cause hallucinations and seizures. Yet for every rational explanation, a counterpoint arose. Paranormal researchers pointed to her knowledge of unknown languages and accurate prophecies, insisting that science still had no answers. Emma remained, as always, trapped between worlds. By the 1990s, Emma's story was entering pop culture. Horror writers and filmmakers drew inspiration from her life. Though names and details were changed, the figure of a pale, haunted child, sickly, prophetic, and tied to supernatural forces, became a recurring archetype in European and American horror. From paperback novels to late-night television specials, Emma's shadow stretched far beyond Altenburg. In 1997, a major turning point came when a German cable channel aired The Haunting of Emma Richter, a docudrama blending historical records with ghost hunting footage. The program claimed to capture unexplained audio near her grave, including what some viewers swore was a girl's voice reciting prayers. Though skeptics accused the producers of staging the evidence, the broadcast renewed international interest. Forums and magazines buzzed with debate: was Emma truly gone, or did her spirit linger in Altenburg's soil? With the arrival of the internet in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Emma's legend spread further still. Online forums dedicated to ghosts and the paranormal circulated translations of old German reports, photographs of her grave, and personal accounts from visitors. Some described vivid dreams of Emma after reading about her, fueling the sense that she was reaching out across time. Others dismissed her entirely, calling her story just another Gothic exaggeration from the 19th century. But whether believers or skeptics, people were talking about her again. She had returned from obscurity into the modern age, reborn as both a case study and a cultural icon. Interestingly, the scientific world never fully abandoned her either. In 2001, a German medical historian, Dr. Klaus Reinhardt, re-examined the original notes of Dr. Vogel. His conclusion was cautious. Emma likely suffered from a combination of epilepsy and extreme malnutrition, worsened by the misguided treatments of her time. Yet even Reinhardt admitted there were details he could not explain. Her sudden fluency in unfamiliar phrases, her apparent foreknowledge of deaths. He ended his article with the line, "Emma Richter remains unsolved, a reminder that history still carries mysteries science cannot tame." Thus, by the turn of the millennium, Emma Richter existed on multiple levels at once. She was a medical curiosity, a paranormal mystery, a tourist attraction, and a cultural archetype. Few remembered the real child who had lived and suffered. Instead, the world saw a symbol, a face of the unknown. And yet, perhaps that is what has always kept her alive. Emma Richter was not merely a child of Altenburg in 1873. She had become a mirror onto which every age projected its fears, its fascinations, its unanswered questions. The 19th century saw her as a battle between faith and demons. The 20th century reframed her as a medical mystery or a restless ghost. The 21st century embraced her as both, weaving her into the endless digital web of folklore and obsession. And through it all, one fact remained unchanged: science still could not fully explain her. Emma Richter, the girl who straddled the line between sickness and the supernatural, had transcended her own time. She was no longer just a story of 1873. She was eternal. Nearly a century and a half has passed since Emma Richter was laid to rest in Altenburg's quiet cemetery, but her story has never been buried. If anything, the modern world has given her a second life, one that stretches far beyond the village where she was born. In today's age of endless information and fascination with the unexplained, Emma Richter has become more than a tragic child of 1873. She has become a global enigma, one whose shadow lingers in history, folklore, and the digital world alike. The first spark of her modern resurgence came through documentaries and ghost-hunting television shows. Networks across Europe and North America, eager to fill hours with chilling mysteries, seized upon her tale. Programs like World's Most Haunted Children and Unexplained Europe featured dramatizations of Emma's seizures, her eerie prophecies, and the exorcisms that failed to save her. Each show presented her slightly differently, sometimes as a victim of demonic possession, sometimes as an unrecognized medical case, sometimes as a prophet ahead of her time. For producers, the ambiguity was gold. For viewers, it was irresistible. The internet amplified this fascination tenfold. Online forums dedicated to the paranormal now host dozens of threads about Emma, with users debating whether she was epileptic, psychic, or possessed. Amateur historians translate old German documents into English and French, spreading the story to audiences who had never heard of Altenburg before. Some claim to have traveled to her grave, posting grainy photos that they insist show strange orbs of light. Others share personal experiences, dreams of a pale child, whispers heard while reading about her late at night, feelings of being watched. Whether true or imagined, these accounts only fuel the legend. YouTube and TikTok have ensured that Emma's name remains alive among younger audiences. Creators post Gothic-style videos recounting her life, overlaying black and white images with haunting music. On TikTok, short clips dramatize Emma's trances or suggest her ghost still haunts Altenburg, drawing millions of views. For a new generation, Emma Richter is not a dusty figure from 1873. She is a living ghost story, constantly reshaped for modern eyes. In Altenburg itself, Emma has become both a blessing and a burden. The town sees a steady stream of tourists, some curious, others obsessed. They come to stand at her grave, to photograph the ruins of the Richter cottage, or to walk the narrow lanes where villagers once whispered her name. Local guides now include her in ghost tours, telling visitors that Altenburg is home to the girl science could never explain. Restaurants sell themed desserts. Shops offer postcards with her grave. The economic benefit is real, but so is the unease among locals who see their tragic child turned into spectacle. Meanwhile, academics continue to wrestle with her mystery. Medical historians pore over Dr. Vogel's surviving notes, seeking clues in her symptoms. Some argue that Emma likely suffered from a rare form of encephalitis that caused seizures and altered consciousness. Others suggest an undiagnosed autoimmune disorder, something her 19th-century doctors could never have understood. Yet each explanation leaves gaps. None can fully account for the testimonies of her sudden fluency in unknown languages, her chillingly accurate predictions, or the strange phenomena reported by so many witnesses. This tension between science and mystery is perhaps what has kept Emma's story alive. If she had been easily explained, she would have faded into history like countless other tragic children. But because she sits on the edge, between medicine and the supernatural, between tragedy and legend, she refuses to be forgotten. She embodies humanity's deepest curiosity, the hunger to know what lies beyond our understanding. Modern paranormal investigators still flock to Altenburg, armed with thermal cameras, electromagnetic meters, and digital recorders. Many claim to capture unexplained voices, some childlike, some whispering in German prayers. A few report cold gusts around her grave, sudden dizziness, or the sensation of small hands brushing theirs. Skeptics argue these are tricks of the mind, amplified by expectation. Believers say they are Emma's way of reminding the world she is still here. Even outside of ghost hunting, Emma has seeped into popular culture. She has inspired novels, horror films, and graphic art. Some depict her sympathetically as a misunderstood victim of her time. Others turn her into a menacing figure, a ghost child who lingers in shadows. Each retelling twists her further, yet none can erase the core of her story. A fragile girl, suffering from forces no one could name, who left behind more questions than answers. What strikes observers most is how Emma has become a mirror. In the 19th century, she reflected the battle between religion and superstition. In the early 20th century, she reflected the growth of psychiatry and the fascination with parapsychology. In today's digital age, she reflects our hunger for mystery in a world where everything seems explainable. She is both victim and symbol, both child and ghost, both history and myth. Altenburg's cemetery still holds her modest grave, worn by time yet never without flowers or offerings. Visitors leave candles, dolls, and handwritten notes. Some ask for protection, others for healing, still others simply whisper, "We'll remember you." For those who stand there, Emma is not just a legend. She is present, tangible, real. And perhaps that is why her case endures. Emma Richter is more than a question mark in medical history. She is a reminder that human life contains mysteries too deep for charts and diagnoses, too strange for neat categories. Her story forces us to confront the possibility that the world holds truths we cannot yet see, forces we cannot yet name. Nearly 150 years on, Emma Richter still stands at the border between the known and the unknown. And until the day science or faith can fully claim her, she will remain what she has always been, the girl science could not explain.